introduction. And thank you to the board and the executive and to Tina and all of Darchei Noam for bestowing this honor on me. Darchei Noam, as you know, holds a special place in my heart, and it's central to the journey you're about to hear about. And mazel tov to you, Mark, my Chatan. I always wondered what it would be like to be with a younger man. It's a delight to share this honor with you. I also want to acknowledge and thank my friends and family joining us today. You are part of this journey, and I'm really touched by your presence. So, I am Esther Rachel, bat Rezel, bat Todres Esther, and Avraham Shmariyahu, ben Moshe v'Rachel. That is where my journey begins. I have been shaped by the history, trauma, and triumph of my family. My identity is wrapped up in the examples they set, the lives they led, their values, and the narratives they wove and passed to me. It begins embedded in that particular history and those actions and values that shape me, but I and my family are in turn embedded in the broader history of our people. My spiritual journey is informed and rooted in family, history, community. In many ways, my childhood and upbringing were unexceptional. I grew up with my brother and parents in Montreal in a neighborhood that was largely Jewish. My Zeta, Todres Shizgal, lived nearby and was a strong and influential presence in my early life. My family life was warm and secure. Big brother, parents, aunts, uncles, cousins. It was the world outside that was scary. The Cold War, the arms race, Vietnam, civil rights. My parents were political, informed, and by times actively fighting for change. Being Jewish was normative. In fact, so much so that at the age of 5, wanting to please my grandfather, who spoke less than perfect English, I asked my mother how to say Zeta in Yiddish. Who knew? I always knew I was Jewish, but my parents were not observant. My mother was in full-scale rebellion from a traditional Orthodox upbringing and found her home in the left-wing politics of the 30s and 40s. And yet, scraps of memory and moments, part of my narrative, who I am, what I believe. The dishes being changed for Pesach so that Zeta and Mom's siblings could come for Seder. Walking home through soggy, almost snow-free fields near my house. My aunts in the kitchen chopping fish. Zeta on the other side of the counter observing, must be Pesach. The cousins bonded together, negotiating for gifts in return for the afikoman. Sitting in shul on the high holidays, slightly bored, playing with the fringes of my father's talit, and this was his kippah actually. And the exciting moment when my Zeta would blow the shofar and all my friends and I would gather around the bima. Sitting on Zeta's lap shortly after I started classes at Jewish People School with the first page of my book, Shalom, Shalom, Shalom. On Zeta's lap again, looking at a picture book commemorating the War of Independence, terrified at the ones of the children in trenches making their way to shelters. I thought he must have been terribly brave to go to that scary place. I still have that book with its copper relief cover, along with a couple of his chumashim. My maternal grandmother and both my paternal grandparents were dead long before I was born. My brother and I bear their names, the weaving and the connecting of the generations. Now, see Esther and cousin Ellen, little girls, giggling with delight on their father's knees. Sam and Harold, singing in tunes I swear only our Shizgal and Enkin families have ever sung to the songs of Pesach, with rousing choruses of Chad Gadya. Esther and Ellen, young adults, still sitting on their father's knees, delighting in them and in our tradition. Esther and Ellen at a Seder without Sam and Harold, but telling the story to my children. Telling the stories our parents told us of their childhood Seders, the incredible sense of that bond, that link, that connection, which shapes and makes us whole, who we are and what we bring to the world. It's interesting how intensely traditional and Jewish all these memories are. They have found a way into my consciousness and speak to me now. Wisps of time and space. For a long time, their significance was really one of nostalgia. It formed my Jewish identity, but it was feelings, not fact or practice. It is only looking back now I understand how much it influenced who I became. My family gave me other gifts. The story of their resilience and devotion to public service, helping others and making a difference. Story of our grandfather's determination to move his family out of the horror that was life in Western Ukraine or Eastern Poland, depending on the year, his leadership in the community there, and his leadership in the community in Montreal. My father, who grew up in an abusive home, to become a loving, gentle man, Uncle Sam, a safe and accepting presence, some of my cousins have told me. The Enkin family, Uncle Max, $1 a year man during World War II, one of the driving forces in the Taylor Project, enabling 2,500 survivors to come to this country to begin again and to contribute to Canada. His son, my beautiful cousin Larry Enkin, has revived that story so that its memories could continue, and more importantly, it would reinforce the values of immigrants at a time when that is being questioned. I want to mention Larry specifically because I cannot contemplate my spiritual journey, my struggle to understand the world, without mentioning his gentle influence and example of looking at the world and finding a way to solve its problems. It's no accident that my cousins, both Enkin and Shizgel, are educators, therapists, researchers, doctors, lawyers, all either professionally and or personally making a difference, giving back. It is that precious legacy you need to know about me, which set the path for my spiritual journey. As much as my family gave me a Jewish identity, they gave me a model of being in the world, a model of connection and caring. More vignettes. My parents welcoming a draft dodger to live for a short time in our basement. Baby teeth for strontium 90 research, voice of women meetings in our living room. Active and lively discussions about politics, justice, Pete Seeger concerts, marching proudly with my mother in anti-war demonstrations. My mother and her sister Jean taking us kids to concerts and recitals, but also to prayer services of other faith groups so that we would know and understand that there was a big world out there and we were part of it. Probably the greatest gift my parents gave me was the encouragement to read, to think, to try and understand the world. Much of what my mother encouraged me to read was about injustice and the writing of it. John Steinbeck, Pearl S. Buck, Upton Sinclair, and the Russians, of course the Russians, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and the great Jewish authors, Ash, Shalom Aleichem, Yud Melamed Peretz. Their influence on me was profound. I mentioned I went to Jewish People School, 4 afternoons a week and Sunday mornings. I learned the songs, the holidays, some Chumash and history. As I got older, I of course resented the time away from friends and extracurricular activities. I lasted till grade 8. The principal told me I would regret quitting, and he's right to an extent. I'm glad for the grounding it gave me, but it was also really traditional. And many of the teachers, older men, were survivors of the Holocaust without much knowledge of how to teach little kids. One of them gave me nightmares for about a year after stories of his family's destruction. I think I was about 8 years old at the time. I went to Jewish summer camps with a twist. The first one was my brother and I went to, along with our cousin David, was called Camp Kisufim, and it was part of the Dror movement. I mean, where else, instead of capture the flag, would you reenact the smuggling of illegal immigrants into the land of Israel? I was about 10 years old, in the middle of the lake, in the dark, in a rowboat, don't ask. And then there was the even more elaborate capitalist day, in which workers were mistreated in various ways most of the day, and I was one of the workers, until we arose and rounded up those exploiters, the head counselor and some of the senior staff, and literally drove them some way down the road out of camp. You know, maybe I didn't have such a typical upbringing. My mother always had an uncomfortable relationship with her own background, its rigidity, its patriarchal treatment of women. And my Zeta was much softer and forbearing with me than he was with his own children. She doubted God, disdained rabbis she thought pompous and inaccessible, and she was too much of a rebel to be comfortable in a 50s or 60s Canadian Orthodox synagogue. She loved Darchei Noam, though. My dad worked 6 days a week and only started attending a conservative synagogue after he retired. He found comfort in the ritual and the community. As I've indicated, I clearly had a kind of warmth and attraction to it, but was made uncomfortable and probably a little confused by my mother's animus. And to tell the truth, as I reached my teens and older, it didn't hold much for me either. I could no longer sit with my father at services. The rabbi was, honestly, a bit pompous, and certainly didn't speak to a young woman growing up in the turmoil of the late 60s and 70s. So those years, like many of you of a certain age, was mostly sex, drugs, and rock and roll, although not necessarily in that order. Seeking spirituality, I studied the lyrics of Bob Dylan, the poetry of Leonard Cohen, William Blake. He who kisses the joy that flies, as it flies, lives in eternity's sunrise. Words one tries to live to. And that sense of joy was elusive, but we certainly embraced life. It was a time full of change and possibility. My sense of social responsibility was lived out in demonstrations against the war and in support of Soviet Jews. I aligned myself with progressive Zionist causes and for a while worked on a student newspaper called Other Stand, where I found so was my cousin Peter. Interestingly, in second year university, I took a course in Jewish history. I was so engaged by a wonderful professor that I actually considered changing my major to Jewish studies. The other option was journalism. My mother says that as a child, I kept her on my toes, on her toes, maybe mine too, with a constant stream of why, how come, what for. When you think about it, good attributes for both journalists and Talmudists. I opted for journalism though, driven by a taste for adventure, curiosity, and a belief I could make a difference. When I look back with hindsight, it's not a surprise that my special interest and knowledge revolves around journalistic ethics and codes of practice. Through those years, I would go home for the major holidays. I have a memory of going to Kol Nidre in Ottawa, where I was studying, and then going to cover some event and working all through the next day starving because I was fasting. It was neither rational nor thought out, just a reaction, I guess, and a habit. But clearly, part of me was looking for a connection to Jewish life. It took a back burner for a while and was revived on my first trip to Israel at 22 when I had graduated university. On my return, I thought about what I could do to live a more consciously Jewish life. I was excited by it. Interesting again, I did not seek out any institutions. They just didn't seem relevant. I did decide to keep kosher for a while as a way of daily reminding myself I'm a Jew, but that didn't really last. It was my feminism that brought me back to an active Jewish life. And it started, sadly, with my father's death. My cousin Elaine took me aside and gently reminded me how close and loving my relationship was with my father, and I had a right to say Kaddish. By then, my brother had become quite traditionally observant, and I didn't want to offend his sensibility, but I asked, and his response? He held my hand at my father's grave, and together we said Kaddish. It had a profound effect on me. If I wanted to be part of this world of Jewish practice, I would have to own it. I was lucky enough around that time to discover a Darchei Noam through my Aunt Jean, who had become a member, very attracted to its sort of intellectual and approach and its social activism. At least I knew there was a place I could belong. When my dear friend Carla's daughter, Sasha, was born, I carried the Torah in the basement of Hove for the very first time. I can't describe the emotion, the shock of it, that I could cradle the scroll. So gradually, with the inspiration of women like Elise Goldstein and Michelle Landsberg, I came to claim half the kingdom. I am proud, along with other members of Darchei Noam, to be a Schwester of Sukkah by the Water. Remember, Phyllis? A project that raised funds, but also united women claiming their traditions. By the time Yehuda and I married, I was engaged in the work of learning what kind of Jew I could be. We talked about creating a Jewish home for our children, making Shabbat, educating them in day schools. And then we looked at each other and said, well, why should we wait? Not for the kids, we could wait. But from then on, we made Shabbat, we lit candles and welcomed the day of rest ever since. And that began the process. Darchei Noam came into our lives right at the start of our marriage. We had found a home. We were ready to make that commitment and needed community to support us as we figured out what our Jewish life would be. I found a place to study text and to further understand what had shaped me. I find it exhilarating to study a piece of Talmud and understand the rabbis were grappling with the same questions of justice or leadership that I was. I discovered the radical amazement of Abraham Joshua Heschel, the rigorous intellectual world of Nechama Leibowitz, layers and layers of meaning. At the same time, I took on more and more ritual practice, Shabbat, keeping kosher, observing all the chagim. It's hard to know which is the chicken, which the egg. The actions enriched and nourished my soul, and the more I do, the more I want to know and do. The more I do, the more I did, the more my life felt complete, connected. I fully embraced Mordechai Kaplan's view that participation in communal life and ritual is what connected me to a Jewish civilization. Life could be chaotic and demanding, but Shabbat comes every 7 days, and the seasons turn and bring the holidays. The rhythm, the continuity, the connection to such a long tradition brought meaning and peace to me. Darchei Noam became my anchor. I met strong, knowledgeable women imbued in our tradition. My kids found a safe and loving environment. They were both named here. They were one on Hove, both on Hove. They had their B'nai Mitzvot there. It seemed only natural to give back. So I became involved in children's programming and services. And from there, it just kind of evolved. I have been on the ritual committee, the board many years ago, part of that time as a VP. Then I had the pleasure of chairing the adult education committee with a terrific group of friends. And I enjoy being Parnas for our services. And then when I wasn't looking, I became president, which brings us to the present. Well, I'm no longer president, but it still brings us to the present. And there is one more experience I'd like to share, an epiphany in my spiritual journey. It occurred in a deserted, empty space, which had been the great synagogue in the town of Vlodava on the Bug River, right on the border of Poland and Ukraine. We haven't been able to prove it, but we think that is based on the incredible research my cousin Peter has done. This is where the Shizgal family originated. I stood in this space in a town without Jews, where they had been an overwhelming majority. On the walls with groups of pictures of the community, ghosts. We know 40 of them who perished bore the Shizgal name. On those walls, in that deserted synagogue, were also, fading with time, the familiar words of our liturgy, part of the Amidah, as well, Michamocha, words I say every Shabbat, Sur Yisrael, arise Israel. You don't have to believe in God to be awed by the enduring meaning of those words, of understanding that we are connected and the sheer power of those words and concepts that anchor us in time and space. Here we are, here am I, rediscovering, reinterpreting, creating Jewish community embedded in the values of Tikkun Olam, embedded in the teachings of Mordechai Kaplan, that we must make our Judaism relevant and inclusive. That's what Darchei Noam has given me. What a huge gift. There was no choice but to give back by working to strengthen this community and its work. I am Esther Bat Rezel of Avraham Shmariyahu. I am blessed to be the wife of Yehuda, the mother of Samara and Abe, sister, aunt, cousin, blessed with enduring friendships. I am proud to be a member of this community. Tina, Rabbi Grimberg, you are an inspiration as I sing knowledge and understanding. You all guide the way of my journey, but the journey is mine alone. I take you with me, the memory of my ancestors, both immediate and far away. How lucky to be a seeker in a tradition that is so enduring, yet so relevant as we attempt to heal this broken and troubled world. That's my journey. Thank you for being part of it. Shabbat Shalom. Chag Sameach.